Hi, my name is Caitlin Kalani, and this is my final presentation for radiobiology. For this project, I decided to look at a study called Dose Effects Models for Space Radiobiology, an overview on dose effect relationships. The authors are listed, and I also included the date published, which was November 8th, 2021, and I also included the DOI so that if you would like to look this up, you can. What is space radiobiology? Space radiobiology is an interdisciplinary science that examines the biological effects of ionizing radiation on humans involved in aerospace missions. One of the relevant topics in space radiobiology is the dose effect models. Dose effect models are crucial for optimizing radioprotection strategies, risk assessment of the health hazard related to human space exploration, reducing damages induced to astronauts from galactic cosmic radiation. These relationships describe the observed damages to normal tissues or cancer induction during and after space flights. These are developed for various dose ranges and radiation qualities, characterizing the actual and the forecast space missions. Looking at 53 papers, there are 7 significant dose effect relationships that were identified. These include eye flashes, cataract, central nervous system, cardiovascular disease, cancer, chromosomal aberrations, and biomarkers. For each of these, the absorbed dose thresholds and the uncertainties/limitations of the developed relationships are summarized and discussed. This study aims to provide an overview of the published dose effect relationships and to illustrate novel perspectives to inspire future research. Introduction. On this slide, I have included a picture of the space station. Space radiobiology and space radiation. There is a growing interest in this field because of the increased capability of technology to foster travel and operations in space. This has also caused renewed interest in additional exploratory and colonization space mission planning. Space radiation environment is composed of multiple radiation species, where the most common type is highly penetrating charged particles from different sources. There are 3 different sources of particles in space: particles emitted by the sun, SPE, from solar activities, particles trapped in the magnetic field of the Earth, which is like the radiation belt, and galactic cosmic rays, otherwise known as GCRs, that come from outside our solar system. This next slide shows that solar radiation comes from the sun and galactic radiation comes from outside our solar system. Space radiation and their penetrating power. The energy spectrum and the abundances of the radiation species depend on the planetary magnetic fields in short-term and long-term solar activities. The presence of shielding on the space stations or spacecrafts changes the incident spectrum and related exposure because when the space radiation particles interact with the shielding structures, it results in secondary particle production. These particles have the ability to penetrate several hundreds of centimeters of materials, including aluminum, tissue, water, and fragment before stopping. The nuclear interactions produce lower Z secondary particles, which are characterized by a lower line energy transfer, otherwise known as LET. These characteristics lead to the secondary particles having a higher penetration range when compared to the primary particles. Space radiation and the reduction of exposure. Radiation exposure reduction on Earth. Several techniques are used to reduce radiation exposure on Earth. These can include time, distance, and shielding. On the right, you can see I have included an image that shows that to reduce radiation exposure, you want to limit your time around the radiation, increase the distance from the radiation, and use shielding against the radiation. But this changes when we're in space. So for radiation exposure reduction in space, distance is not applicable due to the fact that GCRs are isotropically dispersed for the most part. Time exposure reduction is a valid idea, but it is not very achievable because of the time it takes to do the scientific tasks and the spacecraft velocity. Also, if plans are carried out to explore and colonize the moon and Mars, this is not a realistic approach to reducing the radiation exposure. Especially if colonizing the moon and Mars is going to be a thing in the future, time exposure reduction won't really be able to happen because people will be living there. So they can't really limit the amount of time they're there, if that makes sense. So, shielding is the best way to reduce the radiation exposure in space as much as possible. While shielding, while shielding can't absorb all the radiation due to the characteristics of the GCR spectrum, shielding can stop as a bunch of the radiation. These materials need to be optimized, though, for efficacy and cost, while still taking into consideration the materials used and the thickness of the materials. The effects of space radiation. One effect of space radiation is acute radiation syndrome, which is pictured on the left. This is caused by intense and short exposure to SPEs, and this can happen to crews who are unable to reach areas with adequate shielding. Then there's late radiation morbidity, which is characterized by carcinogenesis or CNS damage. This is associated with continuous exposure to GCR, which is very different from the background radiation of Earth. Mathematical models of dose effect relationships are used to explain and predict the clinical and subclinical effects recorded during space missions. Materials and methods. PubMed was used to locate the 53 papers used in this article. The query search included the following string or keywords: space title abstract, model title abstract, radio title abstract. For each detrimental health and tissue effect, an additional search had to be implemented. Example: model title abstract or relationship title abstract, and radiotherapy title abstract or space title abstract, and radiobio title abstract, or dose title abstract. Research was restricted to the past 10 years, with the last search being done on August 30th of 2021. Only papers published in English were considered as well. Dose effect relationships. The effects of radiation exposure in space can show at different times. Short term, which could be eye flashes, are observed immediately and are transient. Medium term, which could be cardiovascular disease, is observed several weeks/months after the exposure, depending on the absorbed dose. Long term, which could be cancer, is observed many years, sometimes 10 to 30 years after the exposure. Eye flashes. The first description of the biological consequences of space radiation exposure on human cells was the subjective sensations of lights on eyes, commonly called eye flashes. This was first observed by Apollo crews. These flashes correlate with charged particles traversing the retina. It was suspected that primary or secondary neutrons and possibly heavy ions cause these flashes. Helmets revealed zinc, nickel, and other heavy metallic ions, which suggests that the environment of spacecraft adds extra complexity to the spectrum of secondary particles. This led to the thought that it was the secondary particles. Preliminary studies indicate that light ions are the most probable particles for generating eye flashes. Cataract. Cataract risk from space radiation seems linear, without a threshold caused by genetic damage, leading to aberrant cellular differentiation of lens epithelial cells. The preliminary results reveal that relatively low doses of space radiation may predispose crew to an increased incidence and early appearance of cataracts. The NASA study of cataract in astronauts was a 5-year longitudinal study. Cross-sectional data analysis revealed a small, deleterious effect of space radiation for cortical and possibly posterior subcapsular cataract lens opacities. Results suggest that there are increased cataract risks at smaller radiation doses than what has been reported previously. Central nervous system. CNS risks during space missions include cognitive function, which are detriments in short term memory, reduced motor function, and behavioral changes, and late central nervous system risks, which could be neurological disorders, which include premature aging, Alzheimer's disease, and other dementia. These risks are of concern for long term space exploration. Radiosensitive animals exhibited significant changes in proteins associated with dopamine receptors and transporters in the brain at mission relevant doses and dose rates. Cognitive detriments associated with changes in neuron morphology and plasticity. Mice observation revealed a dependence on radiation quality and absorbed dose, which suggests that microscopic energy deposition plays an important role. Changes to synapses should be considered with this. Another concern is radiation induced impairment of neurogenesis because of the reported association it has with cognitive detriments after exposure to low doses of high charge and energy particles. Risks could keep astronauts from performing complex executive functions after being chronically exposed to space radiation. Heavy ion irradiation leads to poor or no recovery from impaired neurogenesis at doses as low as zero point 0.5 gray in mice. Cardiovascular disease. Spaceflight based studies found that cardiovascular disease from low dose radiation exposure represents an important issue for space missions, and radiotherapy has experienced in an ever growing number of cancer survivors. No demonstrated relationship between cardiovascular disease risk and low dose cardiac exposures after a space mission. A ground/simulation based study. Radiotherapy and recent epidemiological studies have suggested that an increased risk of cardiovascular disease may also arise from low level exposure. The study of Japanese survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki show increased cardiovascular disease related death risk at low doses. A study on nuclear workers found a significant positive CVD incidence for external exposure with similar results for liquidators working in the Chernobyl zone in the year after the accident. There is evidence of a link between radiation exposure and CVD. However, low dose exposure findings are not compelling because of possible influence of non radiation risk factors. Cancer, spaceflight based studies. There is a 3% risk of exposure induced death, which is used for setting all dose limits for astronauts. Ground/simulation based study. Cancer is a stochastic risk, which means there is the possibility of it occurring even at shallow doses. Uncertainties of cancer risk predictions to exposure to GCRs have been described within the linear additivity model using the approach of Monte Carlo sampling from subjective error distributions. Biomarkers and chromosomal aberrations, spaceflight based studies. Highlight radiation is more efficient in producing complex type chromosome exchanges than sparsely ionizing radiation. This can possibly be used as a biomarker of radiation quality. Chromosomal aberrations in blood samples of astronauts increase with absorbed doses. Frequency of this increases significantly in post flight samples. Biomarkers and chromosomal aberrations, ground/simulation based study. The following biomarkers are proposed to predict the risk of carcinogenesis: complex cluster DNA damage, persistent DNA repair foci, reactive oxygen species, chromosome aberrations, inflammation, mutations, and telomere length changes. Other risks include mucositis, which is pictured on the right, and it can occur after long term exposure to high lead/high energy particles during extended spaceflight. Also, there's the risk of the skin. Since skin is exposed to every external radiation source, it is a good model to study radiation induced effects. Ongoing space radiobiology research. Because of the new interest in space exploration, the European Space Agency, the ESA, is expanding efforts to identify all the required research to launch a European Space Radiation Risk Model that will be known as ESRRM. Conclusion: cancer and toxicity risks remain not accurately quantified despite the technological developments and conceptual advances of space radiobiology and considerable efforts. More research is suggested to increase understanding of biological mechanisms and response to space radiation. Thank you for listening to my presentation.